crossed the bridge at 4 in the morning, carrying everything she owned in a burlap sack slung over her right shoulder. The sack held a kitchen knife, a cast-iron pot her mother had given her the morning of her wedding. 46 years ago, one change of clothes and $214 folded into the inner seam of an apron that nobody knew about. The fog of Iron Creek was thick enough to taste metallic and cold, the kind of fog that erases the world 10 feet in every direction, so that a person walking through it might as well be walking through the space between one life and the next. Dolores Harlan did not look back. She had spent 68 years learning how to move forward, and the lesson had finally taken. The night guard at the far end of the bridge tipped his cap without looking up from his thermos. "Evening, ma'am." She passed him the way weather passes a fence post, and he forgot her before her footsteps faded. Because in a town where the young had already left and the old were just waiting, nobody looked twice at a woman walking alone in the dark. She was furniture. She had always been furniture. The difference now was that she had removed herself from the room. 3 weeks earlier, Ray Harlan had still been alive. He died on a Tuesday in October, with his hand inside a welding glove, sitting on the bench in the shop on Culver Road, as though his heart had stopped between one bead and the next. The apprentice found him the following morning, stiff jaw slack, the visor still up on his forehead. And by the time someone called the house, Dolores already knew, because the coffee she had poured at 6:30 was still sitting on the kitchen table at 7:15 untouched, cooling into something no one would drink. In 46 years of marriage, Ray Harlan had never once let his coffee go cold. He drank it the way he did everything else, without hesitation, without ceremony, and without asking whether anyone else wanted a cup. The mug sat on the table like a small betrayal. She stared at it for 11 minutes before the phone rang, and when it did, she picked it up, already wearing the face she would wear for the rest of the week. The face of a woman who had been expecting this call since the day she married a man who loved iron more than breath. They buried him Thursday afternoon in the cemetery on the hill above town, the one with the leaning headstones and the chain-link fence that the county kept promising to replace. October in Appalachia smelled like wet oak and rust, and the wind came down the valley sharp enough to make the preacher's pages flap, so that he lost his place twice during the 23rd Psalm and had to start the verse over, while the 8 people in attendance pretended not to notice. 8 people. 46 years of sparks and sweat, and the man drew 8 people to his grave. But that was the arithmetic of a dying town, the kind of place where the coal jobs had dried up in the 80s, and the timber jobs followed in the 90s, and by 2003 the only growth industry was leaving. The young ones left for Morgantown or Pittsburgh or Charlotte, and the ones who stayed behind rationed everything, including grief. You did not waste tears on the expected. You saved them for the things that blindsided you. And Ray Harlan dying at 70 in a welding shop was not a surprise. It was a schedule finally kept. Dolores walked home alone after the burial down the gravel path that connected the cemetery to Culver Road, wearing the black shoes she had bought at a church rummage sale 18 years ago, and that had been too tight from the first Sunday she wore them. She only put them on for services and funerals, and since both involved standing still for long periods while someone else talked, the pain seemed appropriate, a kind of penance for being the one still breathing. The shoes pinched her smallest toes into numbness by the time she reached the house, and the first thing she did when she stepped through the back door was take them off and slide her feet into the cloth slippers she kept beside the mat. The relief was immediate and shameful, because relief was not something a widow was supposed to feel on the day of the burial, and yet her body did not care about protocol. Her body only knew that the pinching had stopped. The second thing she noticed was the vase. It was sitting on the mantel in the living room. The porcelain vase with the blue heron painted on the side that she had bought with her own savings at the antique shop on Main Street the year Curtis was born. She had kept it in the bedroom for 42 years, on the dresser beside the window, where the morning light hit it just right and made the heron look like it was about to lift off the glaze. She knew every chip and hairline crack in that vase the way she knew the lines in her own palms. And now it was on the mantel in the living room, centered between two brass candlesticks that belonged to Brenda, positioned as though it had always been there, as though it had simply migrated of its own accord from one room to another. Brenda was in the kitchen wiping down the counter when Dolores passed through. Her daughter-in-law did not look up, did not explain, did not ask. She had moved the vase the way you move something that already belongs to you, with the casual efficiency of ownership. And the message was not in the moving, but in the not asking. Dolores said nothing. She filled the pot with water, set it on the stove, and began peeling potatoes for dinner. Because the dead get buried, but people keep eating, and if she stopped feeding them, she would have to think about why, and thinking was a luxury she could not yet afford. 3 days after the burial, Curtis arrived at the house mid-morning with a man Dolores had never seen before. A short man with a thin mustache and a leather briefcase so worn at the corners that the cardboard skeleton showed through. They sat down at the kitchen table, the three of them, and the short man opened a folder and began to read. The table was oak-scarred with decades of knife marks and hot pan rings, and Dolores had served more meals on its surface than she could count. She had rolled dough on it, balanced checkbooks on it, helped Curtis with long division on it when he was 9, and folded Ray's work shirts on it every Sunday night. It was the most honest piece of furniture in the house, the one that recorded everything and forgave nothing. And now it held a single sheet of paper that unmade 46 years. The will was brief. The house, the shop, the tools, the pending contracts, the trade name, Harlan Welding, the truck, the accounts receivable, all of it passed to Curtis, Raymond Harlan, firstborn son. Dolores Harlan, wife, appeared nowhere. Not a line, not a mention, not even the kind of boilerplate sentence that lawyers insert as a courtesy, the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head. Ray had written her out of his death the way he had written her out of his life, quietly, completely, and without the decency of an explanation. She listened to the full reading without moving. Her hands lay on her lap, one on top of the other, palms down, fingers still. Her eyes rested on a water stain on the wall behind the lawyer's head, a discoloration shaped vaguely like the state of West Virginia that had been spreading for 3 years, and that she had asked Ray to paint over 4 times, and that he never did because Ray did not fix things inside the house. Ray fixed things inside the shop. The house was her jurisdiction, except that it was not her house, had never been her house. And the stain on the wall was proof that jurisdiction without title is just another word for servitude. The lawyer finished reading, closed the folder, aligned its edges with the table edge the way fussy men do, and looked at Curtis. Curtis cleared his throat. The sound was dry practice, the throat clearing of a man about to deliver a line he has rehearsed in the truck on the way over. Mama, you can stay. Brenda and I talked it over. There is the room out back behind the storage shed. We will fix it up for you. No problem at all. The room behind the storage shed was a concrete block utility space, roughly 6 feet by 10. No window, no ventilation. Smelling of mildew and bleach and the particular damp that colonizes spaces where mops go to die. Dolores had stored cleaning supplies in that room for 2 decades. She knew exactly what it looked like, what it smelled like, what it felt like to stand inside it with the door closed. It felt like a coffin with a broom. She looked at her son. Curtis was 42 years old, thickening at the middle, already developing the sloped shoulders that come from leaning over a welding table 5 days a week. He had Ray's jaw and Ray's hands, and she now understood Ray's talent for settling complicated accounts with simple arithmetic. He was not being cruel. Cruelty requires awareness, a flicker of recognition that what you are doing will cause pain. What Dolores saw in her son's face was something worse than cruelty. It was indifference, the blank efficiency of a man who has already solved the equation and moved on to the next problem. He had calculated the value of his mother's remaining years and concluded that a windowless room behind a storage shed was a fair rate of exchange for 46 years of bookkeeping, cooking, laundering, child rearing, and silence. The lawyer left. Curtis left. Brenda did not wait for Dolores to agree to argue or even to speak. That same afternoon, while Dolores was sitting on the back porch watching the light change on the hill behind the house, Brenda went upstairs and emptied the bedroom. She removed Dolores's clothes from the closet, folded them into a neat stack, and carried them downstairs to the room behind the shed, where she had already placed a thin mattress dragged from the attic and a single wool blanket. She rehung the bedroom curtains with a set she had ordered from a catalog, hung her own nightgown on the bedpost, and placed her cosmetics bag on the dresser, beside the spot where the blue heron vase used to stand. When Dolores went upstairs to find her things, she stopped in the bedroom doorway. She stood there for a long time, looking at the room where she had slept for 46 years. The room where she had conceived 4 children and nursed 3 of them through fevers, and sat up with Ray the night his father died. The room that smelled like her, and held the shape of her body in the mattress, and remembered every nightmare she had ever swallowed in the dark. The curtains were different. The nightgown on the bedpost was not hers. The dresser was bare where the vase had been, and in its place sat a tube of hand cream and a bottle of perfume with a glass stopper. The room had been emptied of her the way a house is emptied of a tenant after an eviction, quickly, thoroughly, and without appeal. She went downstairs. She entered the room behind the shed. She sat on the thin mattress and looked at her possessions, the stack of folded clothes on the chair. The cloth slippers, the kitchen knife, the cast iron pot, and the apron with the $214 sewn into its inner fold. Everything she had accumulated in 68 years of living fit on one chair and a strip of concrete floor. She counted the money without taking it out, pressing her fingers against the fabric to feel the bills underneath, verifying by touch what she already knew by memory, because Dolores Harlan had always kept her accounts in her head, and her head had never once been wrong. The other 3 children did not come. Nora sent a text message from Atlanta, 9 words on a small screen. "Sorry, Mama, love you, take care." 9 words. Dolores did not own a cell phone, so Curtis showed her the message on his holding the screen toward her, like a man showing a dog a treat. She read it twice and handed the phone back without comment, because what was there to say about 9 words from a daughter who had 2 hands and a tongue, and a car that could have driven the 500 miles in 8 hours, but chose instead to send 9 words that weighed nothing and meant less. Floyd called from the port in Houston. His voice came through the landline in the kitchen, tinny and far away, with the sound of machinery behind it. And he said he could not make it work, was crazy, he would try to come next month. Next month. As though grief operated on a shipping schedule and could be rerouted to a more convenient date. Dolores told him to take care of himself and hung up and stood with her hand on the receiver for several seconds, feeling the plastic cool under her palm. And then she went back to the room behind the shed and sat on the mattress and said nothing to no one. Manny did not write. Manny did not call. Manny had gone to California in 1998 at 24 years old with a duffel bag and a girl named Heather, and had called home every Sunday for 2 years, then every other Sunday, then once a month, then once at Christmas. 2000, and then nothing. 3 years of nothing. Dolores did not know if her youngest son was alive or dead, employed, or homeless, married, or alone. And the not knowing had become a kind of furniture in her mind. A heavy object she walked around every day without bumping into, because she had memorized its exact dimensions. She spent 6 nights in that room, 6 nights on the thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the house that was no longer hers. The creak of Brenda's footsteps on the floorboards above the low murmur of Curtis's voice through the heating vent. The laughter of her grandchildren. Tommy, who was 7, and Claire, who was 5. The 2 children she had picked up from the bus stop every afternoon for 5 years, and fed and bathed and read to and rocked and loved, with the fierce automatic love that grandmothers carry like a second heartbeat. Brenda had ended that arrangement the day after the funeral with a single sentence delivered over the kitchen sink. "I think it is better if we handle the kids ourselves from now on, Mama Di." The sentence was polite the way a padlock is polite. It did what it was designed to do and felt no need to apologize for doing it. On the sixth night, lying on the mattress with her eyes open in the dark, Dolores arrived at a conclusion that had been forming since the moment the lawyer opened his folder. She did not arrive at it through anger, because anger requires the belief that things should be different. And Dolores had stopped believing that 46 years ago. She did not arrive at it through self-pity, because self-pity requires an audience, and she had none. She arrived at it the way she arrived at everything, through the steady methodical process of accounting. She added up what she had. She subtracted what she owed. And the balance was clear. She owed this house nothing. This house owed her everything. And since it would never pay, she would write off the debt and close the book. On the seventh morning at 3:45, before the first grey light touched the ridgeline east of town, Dolores stood up from the mattress for the last time. She packed the knife, the pot, and her one change of clothes into the burlap sack. She tore the $214 free from the apron's inner seam, folded the bills into her coat pocket, buttoned the pocket shut. She put on her cloth slippers. She opened the door of the room behind the shed, stepped out into the cold October air, and closed the door behind her without sound. She walked down the driveway to Culver Road. She passed the shop. The sign above the bay door still read, Harlan Welding, in the same block letters Ray had painted 15 years ago, the H and the W slightly larger than the rest, because Ray believed that initials should dominate. The sign looked the same as it had yesterday and the day before and every day for 15 years, and it would look the same tomorrow, and Curtis would stand under it and weld the way Ray had welded, and build the way Ray had built, and never once wonder whose hands had kept the books that made it all work. Dolores looked at the sign for exactly 2 seconds. Then she kept walking. She crossed the bridge. Iron Creek ran black below, swollen with October rain, and the fog was thick enough that the far end of the bridge disappeared into white, and she walked toward nothing, which felt appropriate because she was going nowhere in particular. Only away, and away was the only direction that still made sense. She followed the river south, past the last houses, past the shuttered feed store, past the lot where the Methodist Church used to hold its summer picnic before the congregation shrank below the number needed to justify paper plates. The road became gravel, then dirt, then tire ruts in mud, and the houses fell away and the trees closed in, and the world shrank to the sound of her slippers on wet ground, and the smell of the river, and the weight of the sack on her shoulder. After 2 miles, the tree line broke and the land opened into a clearing, nearly 2 acres of bare ground, bounded on 3 sides by scrub pine and on the 4th by the river. This was the place the town called the Heap. It was where the county and half the population had been dumping their refuse for decades, an unofficial landfill that no one had authorized, and no one had stopped, a graveyard of broken furniture, shattered roof tiles, bent rebar, split tires, cracked bathtubs, doorless refrigerators, and every other object that had outlived its usefulness and been sentenced to exile. A chain-link fence surrounded it, but the fence had been breached in 3 places where the posts had rusted through, and the gaps were wide enough to drive a truck through, which people regularly did, backing up to the edge and shoveling out whatever they no longer wanted. Dolores stepped through one of the gaps. She stood at the edge of the dump and looked at the mountains of debris under the thin October moon. The smell was rust and wet earth, and the faint sweetness of rotting wood, and the shapes of the discarded objects in the moonlight looked like the ruins of a civilization that had given up on itself. She felt nothing, not fear, not sadness, not hope, not anger, not the grim satisfaction of a dramatic gesture. She felt empty, and the emptiness had weight, a physical density in her chest, as though someone had removed all her organs and replaced them with wet clay. But then her hands moved. Before her mind gave permission, before she had formed anything resembling a plan or a purpose, her hands moved the way they had always moved toward work. She bent down. She picked up a brick, half a brick, the clean break exposing the red interior. She turned it in her fingers, examined it, set it to her right. She picked up another, this one whole, and set it beside the first. She picked up a length of rebar, felt its weight, tested its straightness against the ground, and set it to her left. Brick right, metal left, wood that still held its grains separate. She worked until the sky turned gray in the east, and the first birds started up in the pines. She did not know what she was building. She did not know if she was building anything at all. She only knew that her hands refused to be still, and that obedience to her hands had never once steered her wrong. By the third day, she had cleared a patch of ground roughly 12 feet square and sorted the debris into piles that made sense only to her, but that she could navigate with her eyes closed. Bricks here, sheet metal there, lumber that had not yet rotted stacked against the trunk of a dead oak at the clearing's edge. Nails, screws, bolts, hinges, anything metal and small collected in a coffee can she had found buried under a collapsed bookshelf. She slept on the ground the first 2 nights wrapped in the wool blanket from the room behind the shed, and on the third night she slept under a lean-to she had built from 2 cabinet doors propped against each other and weighted with stones, which kept the wind off her face if not her feet. On the 4th day, she started fitting pieces together. She used wardrobe doors as walls, bracing them upright with stacked bricks and lashing them to each other with wire she had stripped from a rusted box spring. She raised the floor on wooden pallets to keep the river damp from seeping up through the dirt. She overlapped sheets of corrugated tin for the roof, angling them so the rain would run off instead of pooling. Every piece came from the heap. Every piece had been garbage until Dolores looked at it and decided what it could become. The farmhands from the neighboring property saw her dragging planks at dawn and laughed. The heap lady, they called her, the way you name a stray dog or a local eccentric with amusement and a faint undercurrent of pity that made the amusement feel generous. A county deputy drove out one afternoon, parked at the fence line, and walked over with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Ma'am, you are not supposed to be out here." Dolores straightened up from the pallet. She was leveling, pushed a strand of gray hair off her forehead with the back of her wrist, and looked at him the way she looked at everyone directly, without apology, without deference, and without blinking. "You got a paper that says that." The deputy did not have a paper. He looked at the half-built structure, at the sorted piles, at the woman who was clearly not crazy and clearly not leaving, and he scratched the back of his neck the way men do when they have run out of authority and know it. He walked back to his cruiser and drove away. He did not come back. Meanwhile, in the house on Culver Road, the questions began. Don Muller at the general store on Main Street was the first. He rang up Curtis's Tobacco one morning and let the question drop like a coin on the counter. "Hey Curtis, your mama's still out at the dump." Curtis changed stores, but the question followed him. It found him at the post office, at the bakery, in the pew, at the Methodist church on Sunday morning, in the line at the pharmacy where he picked up Brenda's prescription. Each question was a finger pointed at his chest, and he felt everyone, so he pretended not to the way you pretend not to feel a splinter that has worked its way under the skin and settled against the bone. You ignore it, you adjust your grip, you tell yourself it will work its way out on its own. But it does not work its way out, it only goes deeper. Brenda told the neighbors that Mama D had lost her mind from grief. Poor thing, just went a little sideways after Ray passed. You know how it is with the old ones, they get confused. The story was convenient and almost believable, and Brenda told it with the practiced sympathy of a woman who had learned early that the best way to disarm a question is to answer it with pity for someone else. But the story required a crazy woman living in squalor, a muttering bag lady surrounded by filth, and what the neighbors were hearing from the farmhands and the deputy and Don Muller's wife's cousin, who had driven past the heap out of curiosity, did not match. What they were hearing was that the structure had walls and a door and a roof. And that smoke came from a brick chimney in the mornings, and that was not crazy. That was something else entirely, something that Brenda's story could not contain, and the failure of containment made the questions sharper. Dolores did not know about the questions and would not have cared if she had. She was busy. She had discovered that the southeastern corner of the heap, the oldest section where debris had been compacting for decades, was different from the rest. The soil there was not loose fill. It was dense, deliberately packed, mixed with heavy gravel, and broken stone in layers that suggested intention rather than carelessness. Someone had poured and tamped this ground the way you pour and tamp a foundation methodically with purpose, and the realization nagged at her, the way a wrong number in a ledger nagged at her. Something did not add up. The surface said dump. The substrate said something else. She did not investigate further, not yet. She had a kitchen to finish, a second room to close in water to haul from the public spigot half a mile away. Meals to cook from the dwindling dollars in her coat pocket. Potatoes and dried beans and cornmeal bought a pound at a time from Don Muller's store, because Don Muller, whatever his gossip habits, still sold to anyone with cash. She had enough to do without digging into mysteries, but her hands remembered the density of that packed earth, and her hands, as always, were paying attention. By the end of the second week, the structure had two closed rooms with walls made of salvage doors braced between each other, a kitchen with a brick hearth, where Dolores cooked bean soup and potato hash in the cast-iron pot, and the beginning of something unexpected, an interior courtyard framed with old window casings, glassless open to the sky, letting in light and air, and the sound of the river. The courtyard was not planned. It happened because Dolores had more window frames than wall space and decided to stand them upright in a rectangle rather than throw them away. And the result was a room without a ceiling, a place where inside and outside met, and neither one. And it was the most beautiful part of the structure, because it was the part that served no purpose except to exist. She cooked in the evenings and ate alone, sitting on a cinder block in the courtyard with the pot between her knees. And the silence around her was not the silence of the room behind the shed, which had been the silence of defeat, but a different silence, the silence of a clearing in a forest, open and clean and answerable to nothing. She ate slowly. She washed the pot in water she had carried. She lay down on the mattress she had found rolled up in the debris, a wool-stuffed pad that she had aired in the sun for 3 days before declaring it fit. And she closed her eyes and slept the way she had not slept in weeks, deeply, without dreams, without the sound of Brenda's footsteps above her head. She did not think about Ray. She did not think about Curtis. She did not think about the will or the vase or the room behind the shed. She thought about the next day's work because work was the only language she had ever been fluent in, and it was the only language that had never lied to her. Everything else, love, loyalty, marriage, motherhood, all of it had turned out to be a dialect she had learned imperfectly and spoken to people who were not listening. But work answered back. Work showed results. Work did not leave you out of the will. At night before sleep, she sometimes pressed her fingers against the spot on her coat pocket, where the money sat counting by touch. The bills were thinner now. She had started with 214 and was down to 161. And at the rate she was spending the money, would last another 6 weeks if she ate nothing but beans and cornmeal. After that, she did not know. But she had never known what came after the money ran out. That was not new. What was new was that she no longer had anyone to blame for the not knowing, and the absence of blame felt unexpectedly like freedom. And so on the morning that would change everything, Dolores Harlan was kneeling in the courtyard, scrubbing rust off a hinge with a square of sandpaper she had glued to a wood block, preparing to hang the kitchen door properly so that it would close against the December wind, when a shadow fell across the threshold, and she looked up and saw standing at the edge of the heap with the morning sun behind her, so that her face was in darkness and her outline burned with light. A girl. The girl was thin, brown-haired, barefoot, despite the cold, wearing an oversized t-shirt that hung past her thighs and a pair of shorts that had once been jeans before someone cut them off at the knee with scissors that were not sharp enough. She was maybe 11, maybe 10. It was hard to tell with the thin ones, the ones whose bodies had not been given enough to work with because hunger erases age the way wind erases footprints. And she had a black eye, the left one, not fresh but not healed. The bruise transitioning from the dark purple of impact through the green-yellow of neglect. The kind of bruise that changes color slowly, when nobody treats it, when nobody asks about it, when nobody holds a cold cloth against it and says, "Who did this to you?" and means it. The girl did not speak. She stood at the edge of the clearing with her arms at her sides and her head tilted slightly, the way a bird tilts its head when deciding whether to land or fly, and she watched Dolores work with an intensity that was not curiosity, but something closer to calculation, the look of someone measuring the distance between herself and safety. Dolores saw her. Of course she saw her. She had spent 68 years noticing the things other people overlooked: the cold coffee, the moved vase, the packed earth, the wrong number in the ledger. She saw the girl the way she saw everything, completely, immediately, and without the need to comment on what she saw. She went back to scrubbing the hinge. The sandpaper rasped against the rust. The rust fell in red-brown dust onto the concrete block beneath her knees. 10 minutes passed. The woman worked. The girl watched. The only sounds were the rasp of sandpaper, the river behind the tree line, and a mockingbird in the dead oak that could not decide which song it wanted to sing. Then Dolores reached for a long plank that needed to be held at both ends, while she marked the cut line, and she could not hold both ends and mark at the same time, and she did not look up when she spoke. "You are going to stand there all day, you might as well come hold this." The girl walked over. She took the far end of the plank. She held it steady, both hands knuckles. White grip, stronger than her arm, suggested the grip of a child who has learned that when an adult tells you to hold something, you hold it tight because the consequences of dropping it are worse than the effort of holding on. They worked together for what remained of the morning without exchanging another word. And when Dolores sat down to eat a piece of dry bread with a scrape of peanut butter, she broke it in half and put the second half into the girl's hand without asking if she was hungry. The girl ate fast. She ate the way people eat when they do not know where the next meal is coming from. Hunched over the food, eyes flicking left and right, chewing and swallowing almost simultaneously, as though the bread might be taken away if she did not get it inside her body quickly enough. Dolores watched her eat and said nothing, because she recognized the speed not from her own life, but from the years she had spent feeding Ray's apprentices, the young men from the hollows, who showed up at the shop with empty stomachs and full pockets of pride, who ate as though eating were a competition they could not afford to lose. The girl finished. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Dolores spoke without looking at her. "What is your name, Sparrow?" "My real name is Sarah, but everybody calls me Sparrow." "Who gave you that eye?" The girl did not answer. The silence between the question and the not answer was not awkward. It was full. It contained everything the girl was not ready to say, and everything Dolores was not going to push her to say. Because Dolores understood, with the bone-deep understanding of a woman who had spent 46 years not being asked, that sometimes the only thing a person needs is a place where nobody asks questions and nobody requires explanations, and the price of admission is simply showing up. Sparrow came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She never asked whether she could stay. Dolores never asked why she came. The question that was not asked became the foundation of something that neither of them named, because naming it would have made it fragile, and fragile things do not survive in landfills. They found their rhythm without searching for it. Sparrow absorbed technique the way certain animals absorb terrain, through stillness and attention, cataloging every movement of the older woman's hands until she could replicate it without instruction. Dolores would point at a heap of debris, and Sparrow would know whether to separate the wood from the metal or drag the usable pieces to the staging pile near the courtyard. There was no instruction. There was no correction. The girl observed and performed with the eerie precision of someone who understood that mistakes in her previous life had carried consequences measured in bruises, and so she had trained herself to get things right the first time, every time, because second chances were a currency she had never been issued. Within days, they had established a division of labor that neither of them discussed. Dolores handled the heavy construction, the wall bracing, the roof patching, the brick hearth maintenance. Sparrow handled the sorting, the scavenging, the water runs. The water was the hardest part. The public spigot sat at the edge of the Remedies, the old neighborhood half a mile south, where the county had installed a standpipe in the 70s for the farm workers who used to pick apples in the orchards that no longer existed. Sparrow made the trip twice a day, morning and late afternoon, carrying 2 plastic jugs she had found buried under a collapsed porch, each jug holding 1.5 gallons, each jug weighing 12.5 pounds when full, and the girl carried them without complaint, the way she did everything in silence, with her jaw set and her eyes on the ground in front of her feet. On a Tuesday evening in mid-November, sitting in the courtyard eating bean stew from the cast-iron pot, Sparrow spoke without raising her eyes from her plate, and the words came out flat, without self-pity, with the tonelessness of someone reporting the weather. "My uncle says I am a mouth that costs more than it earns." Dolores continued eating. She chewed. She swallowed. She scraped the bottom of her bowl with a piece of cornbread. The silence between the girl's sentence and her response stretched long enough to hold everything Dolores was not going to say about uncles and cost and mouths and worth. And when she finally spoke, her voice was dry and level, and carried no more emotion than a carpenter measuring a board. "Your uncle does not know how to count. I need 2 hands around here, and you brought 2. That night, Sparrow did not leave. She lay down on the wool mattress in the second room, and pulled the blanket to her chin, and closed her eyes. And in the morning she was still there, and the morning after that, and the pattern hardened into fact without anyone declaring it. Her uncle at the trailer park on the north end of town did not come looking. No phone call, no knock at the fence line, no county social worker with a clipboard and a concerned expression. An 11-year-old girl disappeared from a trailer, and the world did not blink, which told Dolores everything she needed to know about the uncle and the trailer, and the system that was supposed to prevent exactly this, and that had failed so completely, it did not even notice the failure. The structure grew. 3 weeks in the kitchen had a proper chimney stack made from stacked cinder blocks, and a flue pipe Dolores fashioned from a section of stovepipe she found in a tangle of scrap near the eastern fence. The chimney drew well enough to keep the smoke out of the room, and badly enough to leave a permanent haze near the ceiling that smelled like oak and ash, and something almost sweet. The courtyard took shape as more window frames went up, standing like sentinels in a loose rectangle, and Sparrow hung strips of burlap across the openings on the windward side to break the December drafts that came off the river and cut through everything. On the last Thursday of November, Gus Novak appeared. He stood at the boundary of the heap. The way a man stands at the edge of a conversation he has not been invited to join, weight on his back foot. Arms crossed, head moving slowly from side to side with the careful attention of someone who understood the grammar of what he was seeing. He was 73. His grey wool cap was pulled down to his eyebrows. His flannel jacket had been patched at both elbows with squares of canvas that did not match the original fabric, and his wooden toolbox scarred and oil-darkened, and held together at one corner with a bent nail hung from his right hand, with the unconscious ease of a thing that has been carried every working day for decades. He studied the structure for a full 3 minutes before he spoke. And when he spoke, the question was addressed to no one in particular, lobbed into the air the way you toss a stone to see where it lands. "Who framed those door panels?" Dolores answered from inside, where she was wiring a sheet of tin to the roof joist. "I did. You are missing a header beam on the second door. Without it, the first hard rain will bow the frame, and the whole wall section will fold in on itself." Dolores came out and looked at him. Gus Novak had a face that belonged on a currency note from a country that no longer existed, all angles and planes, and deeply scored lines that mapped the topography of 7 decades of weather and labor and solitude. His hands, resting now on the top of the toolbox, trembled slightly, a fine persistent vibration that he controlled by gripping things tightly, which was why his knuckles were permanently white, and his handshake on the rare occasions he offered one felt like a vice. "I know it is missing. I do not have the material." Gus Novak had worked as a carpenter at the Patterson Mill on the Eastern Ridge for 42 years, since the age of 31, since the year his wife told him she was pregnant with their only child, and he walked down to the mill and asked Tom Patterson for a job and got one, and kept it until the tremor started in his left hand and migrated to his right. And Tom Patterson's son, who had inherited the mill, and none of his father's loyalty, clapped Gus on the shoulder and handed him $500 in an envelope and said, We appreciate everything, Gus. 42 years of joints and joists and headers and sills of wood shavings in his cuffs and sawdust in his lungs, exchanged for a clap on the shoulder and an envelope. He lived alone in a rented room near the post office. His wife had died 8 years earlier, a Tuesday pancreatic cancer diagnosed in September, buried in November. His daughter in Pittsburgh called once a month, the same call every time. Are you okay, Dad? Yes. Are you eating? Yes. Okay. Love you. Bye. He walked across the bridge every morning, because if he sat still, the tremor worsened, and if he walked, if he moved, if his body had purpose, even the purposeless purpose of walking from one end of a bridge to the other, the shaking eased, and his hands remembered what they were for. That first morning, he worked 3 hours. He fitted the header beam using a piece of white oak that Dolores had salvaged from a smashed armoire. He measured it by eye the way a man measures who has not needed a tape measure in 30 years. And he cut it with a handsaw from his toolbox and planed it with a block plane that was older than Sparrow and sharpened to a whisper. And he set it in place with wood glue he had brought in a jar and shimmied it with wedges he cut on the spot from scrap pine. The beam fit. The door frame stopped flexing. The wall held plumb. Before he left, he turned and spoke to the air between Dolores and the structure not making eye contact. Because Gus Novak did not make eye contact when he was offering something he could not afford to have refused. Tuesday, I will come back with more glue. He came back Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. He brought his toolbox and he worked without speaking, and he ate what Dolores set in front of him. Beans or potatoes or cornmeal mush. And he left before dark. And he never asked why she was here, or why the girl was here, or what had happened to the life that must have preceded this one. Because Gus Novak understood that people who build shelters in landfills have already answered those questions for themselves and do not need to answer them again for an audience. The structure improved with him in ways that Dolores could feel through her feet. The door frame squared. The walls stopped shifting when the wind blew. The roof leveled out so that rainwater flowed instead of pooled, channeled into a gutter Gus fabricated from half a drainage pipe he and Sparrow excavated from a collapsed section of the eastern perimeter. The gutter fed into a plastic drum, which meant they now had a rainwater reserve that cut Sparrow's spigot trips from 2 per day to 1 and on rainy days to none. And the girl used the freed hours to help Gus, learning from his hands the way she had learned from Dolores's silently by replication, until she could cut a straight line with a handsaw and drive a nail in 3 strokes and identify by smell alone whether a piece of lumber was oak or pine or poplar. The 3 of them were not a family. They shared no blood, no history, no holidays, no surname. But they shared the pot and the courtyard and the silence that filled the space between tasks. And they shared the thing that mattered more than any of those, the knowledge that each of them was necessary. Dolores needed Gus's craft. Gus needed Dolores's purpose. Both of them needed Sparrow's legs and energy, and the particular ferocity of a child who has decided without announcement that this is where she lives now, and that anyone who tries to remove her will discover that smallness is not the same as weakness. On a Wednesday morning in early December, Brenda's blue sedan appeared on the gravel track that led to the heap. She parked at the fence line and got out wearing her church dress, the one with the blue flowers, and carrying a paper bag from the bakery on Main Street. She stood at the edge and looked at the structure, and her lips pressed together in a line so thin they nearly disappeared. And what pressed them was not disgust or pity, but something more complicated, something closer to frustration. Because what she saw did not cooperate with the story she had been telling. A shack would have confirmed the narrative. A pile of junk held together with string and delusion would have made Brenda right, would have justified the phone calls to Nora, the whispered conversations with the other wives at church, the careful, sympathetic headshakes that said, "Poor Mama D, bless her heart." But the thing standing 40 feet away was not a shack. It had straight walls and a functioning chimney, and a courtyard where morning light fell through glassless window frames and turned the concrete floor into a grid of golden shadow. It was a house built from what nobody wanted, and it stood the way its builder stood, without apology, without permission, and without any interest in being approved of. Mama D. Curtis wants you to come home. People are talking. I brought you donuts, the ones you like, from Garrity's. Dolores was kneeling on the ground using her homemade sandpaper block to clean a hinge she planned to mount on the kitchen door. She did not raise her head. Tell Curtis I appreciate it. Take the donuts back. We eat what we cook here. Brenda stood with the bag in her hand, suspended between the gesture she had rehearsed in the car and the rejection she had not anticipated. Her mouth opened, found nothing to say, and closed. She turned and walked back across the uneven ground in her church shoes, wobbling once on a piece of tin, and did not look back. Sparrow, sitting cross-legged on the ground, sorting bent nails from straight ones, watched Brenda leave and spoke with the unfiltered clarity of a child who has not yet learned that observations can be weapons. That lady smells like church perfume. The laugh that escaped Dolores was small, barely a sound, more a shift in the muscles around her mouth than an actual vocalization. But it was the first time her face had moved in that direction since Ray died, and Sparrow noticed. And Sparrow's own mouth twitched in response, and Gus, planing a board in the far corner, glanced up and saw both of them almost smiling, and said nothing, but his hands trembled less than usual for the rest of the afternoon. December deepened. The cold of the river turned the mornings into endurance tests, and Dolores added a second layer of tin to the windward walls and packed the gaps between the door panels with strips of old carpet. She shaved from a roll she found half buried near the northern fence. Sparrow's water trips became harder as the temperature dropped, the jugs heavier in cold hands, the half-mile walk sharper against the wind. But the girl did not complain, and Dolores did not praise her for not complaining. Because between them, the absence of complaint was not stoicism. It was simply the way things were done, the way weather is not complained about, because weather does not listen. Dolores continued to work her way deeper into the heap, clearing ground systematically, pushing into the southeastern section, where the oldest debris had compressed into something that barely resembled refuse anymore. She noticed again what she had noticed weeks earlier, that the soil here was different, packed harder, layered with gravel and crushed stone in a pattern that was too regular to be accidental. Someone had poured this material in courses, stamped each layer flat, built it up the way you build a road base or a foundation pad, with intention, with knowledge, with the kind of labor that does not happen by chance. After 46 years of living beside a man who worked with metal, Dolores knew the difference between something that falls and something that is placed, and this ground had been placed. She filed it in the part of her mind where unanswered questions went to wait, not forgotten, but suspended. The way a carpenter leaves a gap in a frame when the right piece of wood has not yet appeared. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December, the right piece appeared. The light was fading early, the way December light in Appalachia fades not gradually, but suddenly, as though someone had adjusted a dial. Dolores was digging in the compacted section with the short-handled spade, whose grip Gus had repaired the week before. She was removing packed earth, a shovelful at a time, working methodically the way she worked at everything left to right, row by row, when the spade struck something that was not stone, not brick, not concrete, not dirt. The sound was dull and metallic and deep, the kind of sound that thick iron makes when struck by something hard. A sound she knew the way she knew the sound of Ray's hammer against the anvil, intimately, cellularly in the marrow of her bones. She stopped. She struck the same spot again. The same sound returned, resonant and heavy, vibrating up through the spade handle into her wrists. She dropped to her knees and began clearing dirt with her hands. Sparrow appeared beside her, kneeling, digging, asking nothing. They worked for over an hour. The earth here was not loose fill. It was compacted aggregate stone and gravel mixed with soil and tamped into dense layers that resisted fingernails and spade edges, equally the kind of packing that takes effort and equipment. the kind that someone does when they want something to stay buried. Each layer they removed revealed another beneath it, harder, denser, more deliberate. And the deliberation itself was the message. This was not carelessness. This was concealment. What emerged beneath their hands was a steel plate, rectangular, roughly the dimensions of a dining table, thick as 3 fingers held together, riveted along the edges in a diagonal pattern that Dolores recognized instantly because she had watched Ray set rivets in exactly that configuration when he was building gates and heavy doors, the diagonal spacing designed to distribute load evenly across the surface so that no single point bore more stress than any other. Whoever had fabricated this plate knew metalwork, knew it well, knew it the way Ray had known it with the deep practical fluency of a person who thinks in iron. The plate had been placed with care, set level on 4 large stones at the corners that served as bearing points, and then buried under the layers of packed aggregate, hidden under years of additional dumping, concealed so thoroughly that only someone clearing the ground inch by inch as Dolores had been doing for weeks would ever have found it. It had not fallen here. It had not been discarded. It was a lid. At one corner, the plate was slightly raised, warped upward by decades of frost and settlement, leaving a gap just wide enough to slide a hand under. And from that gap, rising through the cold December air like breath from an underground mouth, came a draught of air that did not belong to the season. Not the sharp, dry cold of a West Virginia December. Something different. Something damp mineral carrying the smell of wet stone and deep earth and water that has been sitting in darkness for a very long time. Sparrow pressed her face close to the gap. Her eyes widened. It smells weird, Miss D, like rain except it has not rained. Dolores knelt beside the plate with her palm flat against the steel, feeling the cold air push up between her fingers. Her mind was doing what it had always done, the thing that nobody had ever given her credit for, the thing that Ray had relied on without acknowledging, and Curtis had inherited without understanding. She was reading the evidence. Packed earth above, riveted steel below, cold damp air rising from a depth that the gap alone could not explain. Something was down there. Something large enough to hold air and moisture. Something that someone had sealed and buried, and covered with decades of debris, either to protect it or to erase it. And the difference between those two intentions was the difference between a locked door and a boarded window, and she would not know which one it was until she opened it. She stayed kneeling for a long time, her hand on the steel, the cold air numbing her knuckles. She was 68 years old. She owned a knife, a pot, a dwindling stack of dollar bills, and a house made of things other people had thrown away. She had no standing, no title, no deed, no authority. But she had her hands, and her hands had found a lid. And a lid, by definition, exists to be lifted. Gus arrived at 7 the next morning, carrying the heaviest pry bar he owned. A solid iron rod he had kept since his years at the Patterson mill, and had not touched in a decade because there had been nothing heavy enough to require it. Dolores and Sparrow were already there, kneeling beside the plate, cleaning the edges with their hands, mapping the points where steel met stone. Gus crouched, ran his fingers along the rivet line, and let out a low whistle through the gap in his front teeth. This is not amateur work. Look at the diagonal rivet spacing. Whoever built this plate knew what it was covering, and they wanted it to hold. The 3 of them worked the pry bar into the warped corner and pushed. The plate did not move. They repositioned, bore down again Gus and Dolores on the bar. Sparrow wedging stones into the gap each time the steel lifted a fraction of an inch. 2 hours. The rust had nearly welded the plate to the stone bearing points beneath, and every fraction of movement was paid for in effort, and repaid in rust flakes that fell into the darkness below like dry red snow. When the plate finally shifted far enough, what they saw first was darkness. A circular opening roughly 6 feet across that sank into the earth and swallowed the December light before it could reach the bottom. What they smelled was the same air from the gap, but stronger now. Fuller, a clean mineral coldness that carried no decay, no sewage, no rot, only the deep wet stone smell of water and time. Gus lay on his stomach at the edge and extended his head over the opening. He stayed like that for a long time, looking down, and when he pulled back, his face held an expression that Dolores had seen only once before on the face of the antique dealer on Main Street, when he opened a box of estate jewelry and found a piece he recognized as something that should not exist. It is a cistern, brick-lined with arches. The brickwork is herringbone pattern, the kind I have seen in books about the old settlements from before the war. My grandfather used to say that half this town was built over cisterns that people filled in and forgot about when the county brought in pipe water. This one is still here, and it has been here a long time. Dolores leaned over the edge and looked. The cistern descended roughly 12 or 13 feet. The walls were laid in a herringbone weave of old brick, the kind of meticulous brickwork that speaks of an era when labor was cheap and craft was not optional. 3 semicircular arches crossed overhead, intersecting like the ribs of a whale, supporting the domed ceiling. The chamber was dry, but water lines stained the bricks at various heights. Dark bands that recorded the levels the water had once reached a history written in mineral deposits. Near the bottom, where the lowest bricks met the earth floor, green moss clung to the mortar joints, bright and alive proof that groundwater was close still feeding this chamber from below through capillary action, even though the cistern itself had been sealed above for generations. Sparrow pushed her head between the 2 adults and peered down. "Is it a well?" Gus pulled his cap off and scratched the top of his head, a gesture Dolores had come to recognize as his way of buying time before saying something that mattered. "It is not a well. A well pulls water from underground. This is a cistern, a holding tank for rainwater. Folks around here built them all through the 1800s. They collected rain, filtered it through stone and gravel, and brick kept it clean and cool. My granddad told me there were cisterns under half of Iron Creek that nobody remembered. The county capped them, paved over them, dumped on top of them. Everybody forgot. But they are still down there underneath everything, waiting." Dolores was not listening to Gus. She was looking at something neither of them had noticed. A rectangular recess in the eastern wall of the cistern, roughly 18 inches below the rim, a niche the size of a shoebox cut into the brick. Deliberate squared, not a gap left by a missing brick, but a space built into the wall on purpose. And inside the niche, catching the thin December light that reached it from the opening above, there was something. She did not wait for Gus to tell her it was dangerous. She did not wait for permission or for rope or for a plan. She swung her legs over the edge and began to descend, gripping the rimstones with her hands, her feet finding purchase on the bricks that jutted slightly from the wall face. She had climbed onto the roof of the house to fix the flashing when Ray was too drunk to hold a ladder. She had crawled under the shop to splice a water line when the apprentice refused. Her 68-year-old body knew how to move in tight spaces the way it knew how to peel potatoes from memory, without thought, the muscles performing their work independent of the mind's opinion about whether it was wise. She lowered herself, halfway reached her left arm toward the niche, and her fingers touched cold metal. She closed her hand around the object and pulled. It came free with the sound of rust, releasing a dry scrape like a match striking stone. A tin box, rectangular, heavier than she expected. The lid sealed to the body by a century of oxidation. Gus helped her back up. The 3 of them sat on the ground around the box, breathing hard, the December wind cutting across the opening of the cistern behind them and stirring the cold air that rose from below so that it mixed with the surface cold and created a third temperature that belonged to neither world. Sparrow's voice came first, steady and practical. "Open it, Miss D." Dolores took the kitchen knife from her coat pocket. The same blade she had carried out of the house on Culver Road the morning she left, the blade that had cut bread and scraped rust and pried splinters and served every purpose a knife can serve, when it is the only tool a person owns, and she worked the tip into the seam between the lid and the body of the box and pressed. The rust resisted. She pressed harder. The oxidation cracked with a dry snap and the lid popped open, releasing a smell of old metal and preserved air. The smell of a sealed room opened for the first time in 100 years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had once been green and was now nearly black, were two objects. Dolores unfolded the oilcloth with the care of a woman handling something that might disintegrate if breathed on too hard. The first object was a sheet of heavy paper folded in quarters printed with official type that time had darkened but not erased. She unfolded it slowly, holding the creases as though they were wounds that might reopen. It was a resolution of the county board dated April 17, 1903, declaring the parcel of land on which they now sat a public water source and establishing a permanent public easement, prohibiting the sale, transfer, or private use of the property in perpetuity. It bore the signature of the county board chairman and the county seal embossed into the paper so deeply that Dolores could feel its outline with her thumb, 101 years after it had been pressed. The second object was a silver coin tarnished black. One side bore a small engraved image of Our Lady of Sorrows, the same image that hung above the votive candles in the little Catholic church on the hill, where Dolores had attended Mass every Sunday as a child and every Easter as an adult, and where she had not been since Ray's funeral, because she no longer had anything to ask for and nothing left to confess. She turned the coin over. On the reverse, cut into the silver with a crude tool, each letter uneven but deliberate in the way handwriting is deliberate when the writer wants every word to outlast them, was a single line. For those who don't quit. She read it once in silence, her lips moving without sound. She read it again out loud this time, her voice rough and low and shaking at the edges. She tried to read it a third time and could not because her mouth was trembling and her throat had closed, and something inside her chest had shifted, not broken, not healed, shifted the way tectonic plates shift to relieve pressure that has been building for years. And the shift was not dramatic and it was not loud, but it changed the landscape permanently. Sparrow placed her hand on Dolores's forearm. The girl's hand was small and calloused and warm, and it did not squeeze or pat or stroke. It simply rested there, present the way a hand rests on a table, with weight and intention, and no need to explain itself. Gus removed his wool cap and pressed it against his chest with both hands. His eyes were red but dry because men of his generation did not weep in front of others. But the way he held the cap against his sternum said everything that weeping would have said, and more because it said he knew what he was witnessing and that it mattered, and that he would not cheapen it with words. Nobody knew who had placed the box in the cistern wall, whether it was the last county clerk who knew about the cistern before someone ordered it sealed, or a woman like Dolores who watched the evidence disappear from the official files and hid it in the one place nobody would think to look, inside the very thing the document protected. The box had waited in its brick niche for more than a century, sealed under a riveted steel plate, under decades of compacted fill, under mountains of discarded furniture and broken appliances and every other thing the town had thrown away, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig through all of it, someone who had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, and hands that refused to stop working. Dolores slipped the coin into her coat pocket against her chest, and the tarnished silver settled against her skin beneath the fabric, cold at first, and then warming slowly degree by degree until it matched her body temperature, and she could no longer tell where the metal ended and she began. Something moved inside her, not joy, not triumph, not vindication, something deeper and quieter than any of those, something without a name in any language. She knew the sensation of standing in the exact place she was supposed to stand, after 68 years of standing in the wrong ones. The news crossed the bridge before the week was out. Don Muller told his wife over dinner, and his wife told the baker at Garrity's the next morning while buying rye bread, and the baker told the Methodist preacher when he came in for his usual Wednesday cinnamon roll, and the preacher told half the congregation the following Sunday, in a tone that blurred the line between sermon and gossip so skillfully that nobody could accuse him of either. By Tuesday, a man Dolores had never seen before appeared at the edge of the heap. Tall, thin, wire-rimmed glasses, leather briefcase bulging with papers, introducing himself as a professor of American history at West Virginia University, who had driven 2 hours from Morgantown because a colleague's wife had mentioned the story at a faculty dinner And he had not believed it, and now needed to see for himself. He descended into the cistern on a rope ladder Gus had rigged from nylon cord and broom handles. He spent 40 minutes below running his fingers over the brick courses, measuring the arch spans with a tailor's tape he kept in his breast pocket, photographing the herringbone pattern from multiple angles with a compact digital camera, whose flash turned the ancient brickwork blue-white with each click. When he climbed back up, his glasses were fogged with the moisture from below, and his expression had shifted from professional skepticism to something closer to reverence. The cistern dates to the mid-19th century, likely 1840s or 1850s, consistent with the first permanent settlements in this valley before the war. The brickwork is exceptional pre-industrial craft, hand-fired local clay. I have seen this style in only 3 other documented sites in the state. The county resolution of 1903 is authentic. Paper composition, ink, type, seal impression, typeface. Everything is consistent with the period. This document is real. The weekly county paper ran a story the following Thursday, front page below the fold, with a photograph of the cistern opening that made it look like a wound in the earth. The larger paper in Charleston picked it up 3 days later. Shorter version, different photograph. This one showing Dolores standing beside the opening with her arms at her sides and her face unreadable, and the caption identified her as Dolores Harlan, 68, of Iron Creek, which was technically accurate and existentially absurd because Dolores did not live in Iron Creek. She lived in a structure made of salvage doors and pallets on a landfill that Iron Creek had spent decades trying to forget. Curtis read the Charleston article at the kitchen table on Culver Road, the same table where the lawyer had opened the folder, and Brenda watched his jaw tighten as his eyes moved down the column. She had seen that particular tightening before, the clenching of a man who has discovered that a problem he declared solved has reopened itself in public, and she knew better than to speak first. Curtis set the paper down, pushed his chair back, and left the house without saying where he was going. That afternoon, for the first time, he drove to the heap. He parked at the fence and did not get out. He sat in the truck with the engine off and looked at what his mother had built, the walls and the chimney and the courtyard, and the girl sweeping the patio with a broom made of bundled branches. And he stayed for 5 minutes, and then he started the engine and drove away. Dolores saw him from the kitchen. She did not go out. He came back 10 days later. This time, he turned the engine off. He got out of the truck and stood at the fence line with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he stood there long enough for the cold to find the gaps between his collar and his neck. And he looked at the courtyard where Sparrow was stacking firewood in a pattern that alternated thick logs with thin ones for airflow, the way someone had taught her, and at the chimney that was putting out a thin line of white smoke that smelled like oak and beans, and at the bench Gus was sanding in the last of the afternoon light. He did not come inside. He did not call out. But he stood there for 20 minutes instead of 5. And before he left, he walked to the gap in the fence and placed a cardboard box on the ground just inside the wire. Dolores found it after he drove away. Inside were 2 wool blankets, a bag of dried pinto beans, and a box of kitchen matches. No note. The box sat on the courtyard floor between Dolores and Gus and Sparrow, and nobody said anything about it because the contents of the box were not an apology. They were the first syllable of a sentence Curtis did not yet know how to finish. The county, however, did not remain silent. The heap occupied 2 acres of land that appeared on county maps as undesignated public space, which in the language of rural government meant land that nobody had bothered to classify, because nobody had wanted it enough to fight over. But 3 months before Dolores arrived, the county board had signed a preliminary agreement with Ridgeline Properties, a development company out of Beckley, to purchase the parcel for construction of a 32-unit affordable housing complex. The project was the centerpiece of the board chairman's re-election campaign. He had mentioned it in 2 stump speeches and a radio interview on the Beckley AM station, calling it proof that the county was forward-thinking and growth-oriented and committed to providing homes for working families. The affordable housing complex was his legacy project. The thing he would point to in 20 years and say, I did that. And the discovery of a 19th century cistern and a 101-year-old county resolution establishing a permanent public easement over the exact parcel he had agreed to sell was, from his perspective, not a historical find. It was a detonation. The board chairman's name was Ed Tolley. He was 58 years old, third-generation Iron Creek, and he had served on the county board for 11 years with the particular brand of small-town authority that derives its power not from vision, but from the absence of opposition. He was not corrupt in the way that movie politicians are corrupt with briefcases of cash and secret meetings in parking garages. He was corrupt in the Appalachian way, which is smaller and sadder. The corruption of a man who genuinely believes he is doing the right thing while arranging the paperwork so that the right thing happens to benefit his brother-in-law's construction company, which had been named as the primary contractor for the Ridgeline project. Ed Tolley had referred to Dolores in a conversation with the county sheriff 3 weeks after she arrived at the heap as that homeless woman out at the dump. And the phrase had traveled through the sheriff's office and into the diners and barbershops with the speed and accuracy of a bullet. 2 days after the Charleston article appeared, Ed Tolley dispatched the county attorney to examine the resolution and find a way to make it not matter. The county attorney was a young man named Hargrove, who had passed the bar on his second attempt, and whose primary qualification for the position was that he was Ed Tolley's nephew by marriage. Hargrove reviewed the resolution, consulted with a property lawyer in Beckley by phone, and produced a 3-page memo arguing that the 1903 easement had been effectively superseded by subsequent county zoning actions, that the designation of public water source was obsolete because the county had operated a municipal water system since the 1930s, and that a permanent easement required periodic reaffirmation to remain enforceable, and since no reaffirmation appeared in county records, the easement had lapsed by abandonment. The memo was legally fragile, and Hargrove knew it, but Ed Tolley did not need airtight law. He needed plausible language, something that would survive a county board vote long enough to push the Ridgeline deal through before anyone with real legal knowledge could intervene. The vote was scheduled for the next regular board meeting in February, and Tolley had the votes. 3 of the 5 board members owed him favors of varying size, and the other 2 were unlikely to obstruct a housing project that polled well with voters. Dolores did not know about the memo or the vote or the Ridgeline deal. She knew only that the resolution existed and that it said what it said, and she held it the way she held everything close carefully, without trusting anyone else to hold it for her. She had sealed the original document in a plastic bag and stored it inside the cast-iron pot with the lid on, and the pot sat in the corner of her bedroom where she could see it from the mattress. And at night she sometimes looked at the dark shape of the pot and thought about the woman or the man who had placed it in the cistern wall a century ago, and wondered whether that person had felt the same thing. She felt now the understanding that a piece of paper is both the most powerful and the most fragile thing a human being can possess, because it can change the world or be destroyed by a match. And sometimes both happen in the same afternoon. The intervention came from a direction she did not expect. Margaret Webb was 29 years old, 5'4", and in the final year of a doctoral program in public land law at the WVU College of Law. She had read the Charleston article on her phone during a break between seminars, and something about it had snagged on a hook in her mind that she could not shake loose. Not the cistern, not the history, but the easement. A permanent public easement established by county resolution in 1903. She had spent 3 years writing a dissertation about exactly this kind of instrument. The forgotten legal mechanisms that small communities had used in the 19th and early 20th centuries to protect shared resources from private seizure. And here was a living example, not in an archive, not in a footnote, but in a landfill in a county she could drive to in 2 hours. She contacted Dolores through the Methodist preacher. Because Dolores had no phone, no address, no email, no way to be reached except through the human network of a small town where everyone knew where everyone else was, even when they pretended not to. The preacher drove Margaret to the heap on a Thursday afternoon, and Margaret sat on an overturned crate in the courtyard and listened while Dolores explained what she had found. And Dolores explained it the way she explained everything briefly, without embellishment in sentences stripped to their load-bearing elements. Margaret examined the resolution. She held it up to the December light and studied the watermark and the seal and the signature. And then she put it down and looked at Dolores with an expression that was not sympathy and not admiration, but something professional and precise, the look of a person who has found the missing piece of a puzzle she has been assembling for 3 years. Mrs. Harlan, a permanent public easement under West Virginia law does not expire. It does not lapse. It does not require renewal or reaffirmation. It can only be extinguished by a formal act of the same governing body that created it, and only for cause and only after public notice and hearing. I have spent 2 hours searching the county records online, and there is no resolution of extinguishment. There is no record of public hearing. There is no record of any official action whatsoever regarding this easement since 1903. It is still in force. It has always been in force. And the fact that the original document disappeared from the county files is not evidence that the easement ceased to exist. It is evidence that someone wanted it to appear that way. Margaret paused and then continued with the directness that Dolores recognized, because it was her own directness reflected back at her from across a generation. I will represent you pro bono. You will not owe me anything. And we are going to make this very difficult for the people who want to pretend that piece of paper does not exist. Dolores looked at her for a long moment, the way she looked at joints and hinges and ledger entries assessing structural integrity. I'm not looking for anything for myself. I want the cistern restored. I want the land kept open. And I want to make sure nobody buries it again. Margaret nodded once. That is exactly what we will argue. The weeks between Margaret's arrival and the February board meeting were filled with the kind of work that does not photograph well. Phone calls, records, requests, legal briefs, emails to the state archives in Charleston. A formal petition filed with the county board demanding that the Ridgeline Agreement be reviewed in light of the 1903 easement. Margaret worked from her apartment in Morgantown and drove down twice a week to meet with Dolores, and their meetings had the efficient intensity of 2 women who do not waste words. Margaret laying out the legal strategy in terms Dolores could evaluate, Dolores asking questions that cut through the jargon to the structural point, the way her kitchen knife cut through rust. Ed Tolley responded by accelerating the timeline. He moved the board vote forward by 2 weeks, scheduling it for the first Tuesday in February, and he leaked to the county paper that the affordable housing project would create 40 construction jobs and bring an estimated $2 million in economic activity to the county numbers that were optimistic in the way that campaign numbers are always optimistic, rounded up at every stage, until they described a reality that existed only in the spreadsheet. The public hearing was held on a Tuesday evening in the county board meeting room, a low-ceilinged space with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs, and a long folding table at the front where the 5 board members sat with paper cups of coffee, and the unease of people who had expected a routine vote and found instead a full room. The turnout surprised everyone, including Tolley. Farmers in clean overalls, retired miners with their caps in their laps, wives from the Methodist Church, the preacher himself seated in the 3rd row with his Bible on his knee, the reporter from the weekly paper, a young woman with a notepad and a recorder, and in the front row Dolores Harlan, in the cleanest clothes she owned, the same shirt and trousers she had carried out of the house on Culver Road in a burlap sack 4 months earlier, washed and pressed flat with the bottom of a heated cast-iron pot, because she did not own an iron. Around her neck, visible above her collar, the blackened silver coin on a strip of leather. Sparrow sat to her left. Gus sat to Sparrow's left, his wool cap on his knee, both hands gripping the seat of his chair. Hargrove presented the county's position. The easement was obsolete. The water source designation was moot. The housing project served a greater public interest than a hole in the ground. He spoke for 12 minutes and used the phrase forward-looking 4 times, and the phrase community benefit 6 times, and the phrase fiscal responsibility 3 times, and he did not once mention the name Dolores Harlan or acknowledge that she was sitting 8 feet away from him. Margaret Webb rose and dismantled the argument in 9 minutes. She cited the West Virginia Code Section 36 Article 3 governing public easements and demonstrated that no provision existed for lapse by abandonment. She presented the state archival search showing the absence of any extinguishment resolution. She displayed a timeline showing that the original county file for the parcel had been purged of all references to the easement at some point between 1929 and 1941, a gap that corresponded precisely with the period when the county had sold timber rights on adjacent parcels to a logging company, whose principal investor was the grandfather of the current board chairman's brother-in-law. She did not say the word corruption. She did not need to. The timeline said it with the cold authority of dates and signatures. Then Hargrove played the card that Tolley had prepared for him. The county respectfully submits that Mrs. Harlan lacks legal standing in this matter. She does not own the parcel. She does not hold any recorded interest in the land. She has no legal address. She is with respect a squatter on county property and does not possess the standing to bring a challenge before this board. The word squatter detonated in the quiet room like a glass dropped on tile. Dolores did not move. Her hands remained on her thighs, her spine straight, her eyes fixed on Hargrove, with the same expression she had worn when the lawyer read Ray's will. The look of a woman absorbing impact without flinching. Because flinching is a luxury available only to people who have somewhere soft to fall. Margaret started to rise. Dolores felt the attorney shift beside her and knew that a legal rebuttal was forming something about third-party beneficiary standing and public interest exception and the procedural right of any county resident to challenge a land use action. Margaret had prepared for this. They had discussed it on Tuesday, sitting in the courtyard, and Margaret had laid out the precedent and the statute and the case law with the meticulous confidence of someone who had built her career on exactly this kind of argument. But Margaret did not get the chance to deliver it. From the last row of plastic chairs where he had been sitting unnoticed since before the hearing began, Curtis Harlan stood up. The creak of the plastic chair was the loudest sound in the room. Every head turned. Curtis was standing with his hands on the seat back of the chair in front of him, gripping it the way a man grips a railing on a high bridge, not for balance but for the permission to keep standing. When every instinct says, "Sit down, shut up. This is not your place." His face was flushed. His jaw worked twice before the words came, and when they came, they were not polished and they were not rehearsed, and they had none of the lawyer's smoothness or the politician's rhythm. They had the raw, unfinished texture of something true. That woman built a house out of things I would have stepped over without looking down. She found what this whole county buried and forgot. If anyone in this room has standing to talk about that piece of land, it is her, and every one of you knows it. He sat down. His hands were shaking not with Gus's tremor, but with the adrenaline shaking that follows the moment when a person says out loud the thing they have been unable to say for months. The thing that has been building behind the sternum like a held breath. And the release is not relief, but a different kind of weight. Lighter and harder to carry, because it is the weight of having finally been honest. Dolores looked at her son across the room. She did not stand. She did not cross the distance. She did not open her arms or soften her expression or weep or forgive, because forgiveness was not what this moment was about. This moment was about a man choosing for the first time to stand in public beside the woman he had privately dismissed, and the choice did not erase the dismissal. It did not undo the will or the room behind the shed or the months of silence, but it changed the arithmetic the way a single digit added to the right column changes a total, and Dolores, who had always kept her accounts in her head, registered the change without displaying it. She looked at Curtis, and she nodded once a motion so small it might have been a blink. And Curtis nodded back, and between the two nods lay everything that could not be said and did not need to be. In the parking lot outside, Brenda sat in the blue sedan with the engine running and the heater on. She could see through the meeting room windows. She could see Curtis standing and sitting. She did not come inside. The distance between the parking lot and the meeting room was 40 feet, and it might as well have been the river. The board voted the following week after 2 closed sessions and a second legal opinion that Tolley commissioned from a Beckley firm that charged $400 an hour, and told him what Margaret Webb had told Dolores for free. The easement was valid. It had never been extinguished. The ridgeline agreement was unenforceable as long as the easement stood, and extinguishing it now, after public disclosure of the historical record and media coverage that had reached Charleston and was making its way to Wheeling, would expose the county to litigation it could not afford and scrutiny it could not survive. The vote was 4-1. Tolley cast the lone dissent. The ridgeline agreement was voided. The cistern was placed on the County Register of Historic Sites. The resolution of 1903 was entered into the county archive under supervised custody with a certified copy sent to the State Historical Office in Charleston and another to the WVU Library so that it could never again be lost from only one place. The parcel was designated a protected community space, permanent, irrevocable, open to the public. Tolley signed the paperwork at the next board meeting. He signed with a ballpoint pen that he uncapped and recapped twice before touching it to the signature line. And he did not look at Dolores, who was sitting in the front row in the same clothes and the same silver coin around her neck, and the same expression she had worn the night of the hearing. The expression of a woman who has asked for exactly what she wanted and received exactly that and nothing more. What she had asked for at the hearing, when the board chairman grudgingly turned to her and asked if the petitioner wished to make a statement, was brief enough to fit on a postcard. I do not want anything for myself. I want the cistern restored. I want this land open for everyone. And I want to make sure nobody buries it again. Spring came to Iron Creek the way it always comes to Appalachia. Not gradually, but in surges, a warm day followed by a freeze, followed by 3 warm days, followed by rain, followed by an explosion of green, so sudden and total that the hills looked like they had been repainted overnight. The cistern opening was fitted with a proper stone curb that Gus built from salvaged limestone he shaped by hand, and a wooden cover with hinges that could be lifted for viewing and lowered for safety. The County Historical Society installed a small bronze plaque near the edge of the parcel. Dolores did not attend the unveiling ceremony because she was inside the structure cooking a pot of beans and did not see the point of watching people admire something she had dug up with her own fingers. Sparrow did not go back to the trailer park. The question of custody and guardianship resolved itself in the way that such questions resolve themselves in small Appalachian towns, when nobody with authority wants to make a fuss. The Methodist preacher spoke with the County Family Services Office, and the Family Services Office spoke with the uncle, and the uncle, who had never filed a missing persons report, and had in fact told a neighbor that the girl had gone to live with relatives, signed a temporary guardianship transfer to a woman named Dolores Harlan, whose listed address was care of the Iron Creek Methodist Church, and the paperwork was filed and the matter was closed. And Sparrow remained where she had been since November, in the second room of a house made from what the world discarded, sleeping on a wool mattress, eating from a cast-iron pot, carrying water when it did not rain, and reading books that the preacher's wife brought in grocery bags every other Saturday. Gus continued to arrive each morning with his toolbox. He was building a bench for the courtyard now, a proper bench with a backrest and armrest and joints so tight you could not slide a piece of paper between them. The bench was the best work he had done in years, and he knew it. And the knowing was visible in the way he ran his palm across the sanded surface each evening, before he left, the gesture of a man reacquainting himself with his own skill. His hands still trembled, but less, and on good days when the sun was warm and the work was absorbing, and the girl was holding the end of a board steady, while he cut, the tremor disappeared entirely for minutes at a time, And during those minutes, Gus Novak's hands remembered what they had known for 42 years, that they were made for making things, and that making things was the closest he had ever come to prayer. On a Sunday in early April, Curtis's truck appeared on the gravel track again. This time Brenda was not in it. Tommy and Claire were. Curtis parked at the fence, opened the tailgate, and the two children jumped down and ran through the gap in the wire and into the courtyard before Curtis could tell them to slow down. Claire reached Dolores first, colliding with her legs at full speed, wrapping both arms around her grandmother's thighs with the unquestioning ferocity of a 5-year-old who does not understand estrangement and does not care to learn. Tommy stood back, 7 years old and already cautious, already reading the room. But when Dolores extended her hand, he took it and held on. Curtis stayed by the truck. Dolores looked at him over the heads of the children. He raised one hand, not a wave, just an open palm held up for a moment. And she raised hers back, and the distance between the truck and the courtyard remained what it was. But the air inside it had changed. The way air changes after a long rain when the pressure drops and the sky opens and the light comes through at a different angle. That same week, a postcard arrived at the Methodist Church addressed to Dolores Harlan. The front showed a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge in fog. The back held 6 words in handwriting she had not seen in 3 years. Still here, Mama, love Manny. The preacher brought it to the heap on Saturday, and Dolores put it on the shelf above her mattress beside the cast-iron pot and did not mention it again. But Sparrow noticed that the postcard stayed there, leaning against the wall, and that Dolores glanced at it sometimes in the mornings the way a person glances at a window to check whether the sun has come up. They were not a family in any definition the law recognized. No shared blood, no shared name, no shared history before October of the previous year. But they occupied the same space and ate from the same pot and built the same walls and breathed the same air and understood without discussing it that each of them had been discarded by a different hand and deposited in the same place, and that the coincidence was not accidental. It was the arithmetic of necessity, the equation that forms when 3 people who have nothing discover that nothing divided among 3 becomes enough. Dolores slept each night with the silver coin warm against her sternum, the leather cord looped around her neck, the tarnished surface pressing against skin that had thinned with age until the veins showed through like rivers on a relief map. She no longer needed to read the inscription. The words had migrated from the metal into her body, into the muscles of her hands and the bones of her back, and the part of her mind that had kept the books and counted the money and measured the worth of everything she had ever been given and everything she had ever been denied. The words were not a promise made by someone else. They were not a motto or a slogan or an encouragement offered from a distance by a voice that did not know her name. They were a description, an exact, unadorned, factual description of what she was. On a Saturday morning in late April, when the dogwoods along the river had bloomed white and the air smelled like warm mud and new grass, Sparrow knelt beside the cistern opening and dug a hole in the soft earth with her hands. She placed into the hole a small apple sapling, a bare root whip no thicker than her thumb, purchased for $3.75 from the garden section of the hardware store on Main Street, with money she had earned sorting scrap metal that Dolores sold by the pound to the recycler in Beckley. She tamped the soil around the roots and poured a tin cup of water from the rainwater drum, and sat back on her heels and looked at the tree, which was barely taller than she was, and so thin that the April wind bent it nearly horizontal. Dolores came out of the kitchen carrying 2 bowls of oatmeal and stopped when she saw the sapling. "What did you plant, apple tree?" What for Sparrow considered the question with the seriousness she gave to everything. The seriousness of a child who has learned that careless answers carry costs. "Because I want something here that lasts longer than us." Dolores handed her a bowl of oatmeal and sat down on the bench Gus had built and looked at the sapling bending in the wind beside the stone curb of the cistern. The tree was fragile and absurd, a stick in the dirt next to a hole in the ground, next to a house made of garbage. And the whole arrangement should have looked like failure, but it did not. It looked like the beginning of something that had not been named yet. because the language for it had not been invented, something that would require years of growth and patience, and the stubborn refusal to die that apple trees share with certain women and certain girls, and certain old carpenters whose hands remember what the rest of the world has forgotten. She ate her oatmeal. The coin hung warm against her chest. The wind shifted and the sapling straightened, and for a moment it stood upright on its own, thin and impossible and alive.